Good afternoon and welcome back to another ironic introduction to another video. Today I have the top 10 champions I would turn Suicide Masteries on for. There will be a counterpart video to this, and that will be the top 10 champions I would turn Suicide Masteries off for. And if you only care about the list itself, I will have that in the description below. But if you care about the explanations, go ahead and stick around. So up first, I have like 3 honorable mentions. So up first, I have Dormammu, who is double immune and a solid power control champion. The reason he doesn't quite make the list is there's a lot of great suicide-friendly champions, and Dormammu's value really comes from his power control mechanics, and you really don't need that you don't really need suicides in order to get that value out of him. Even with suicides on, he's not exactly the hardest hitting champion, so I don't feel like there's the biggest loss when you're not running suicides. So overall, just a great champion, but doesn't quite reach the top 10. Next up, as an honorable mention, I have Emma Frost. Emma Frost shrugs both debuffs at the start of every fight. She is a special 2 priority champion, so you're not taking the most amount of damage from recoil, and overall is an absolute great champion. But again, when you're narrowing it down to 10, you got to cut the bar somewhere. And then my last honorable mention here is Nick Fury. Now, the thing about Nick Fury is you're not running suicides for him, you're only running them for this restoration kit synergy with the deadpools, because when you run suicide and you run like a half suicide friendly champion for Nick Fury plus deadpool, you get this free potion every single fight, and it can make questing very resource friendly, so long as you're okay with sacrificing 2 of your team strictly for synergies. So that said, let me dive right into the list with number 10. So number 10 is Darkhawk. Darkhawk is an absolute beast of a champion. When you run your synergies, you have him awakened and high sig. This guy can just do so much work as a taxi. And the reason he is so suicide friendly is as a robot, he is double immune, meaning that you're not taking any damage from either of the suicide masteries at the start of every fight. And when you change modes, you regenerate a good portion of health, about 10%, which means that you're really getting a little bit of healing, but for the most part mitigating all of the recoil damage, and it's a really good time. So as long as you aren't sub 5% and you're killing yourself to recoil, or you aren't ending the fight within 2 seconds, which is the duration of time it takes for the heal to proc, or suffering from like Despair Mastery or Heal Block, etc., Darkhawk can fully mitigate recoil damage, which makes him very suicide friendly, since besides the actual inherent damage you take from suicides, recoil is probably the worst part of running the Masteries. And Darkhawk is a great champion to have. I feel like if he hit just a little bit harder or had like a heal block on his special 1, this champion could do so much more, but even as is, he is an absolute powerhouse, well deserving of number 10. At number 9, I have Ghost Rider, and fun story, Ghost Rider is actually the champion that when I pulled him as a 5-star made me turn full suicides on. Before I had Ghost Rider, I was using Omega Red to taxi my way through Alliance Quest, and if you know, I still only have a 4-star maxed Omega Red, and as I found myself in higher prestige rated alliances, I found the 4-star just couldn't keep up. Like, he did a lot of work, and for a really long time I used him, even with a rank 4 Ghost Rider. But when you're running into like Sentinels and you're running into the Ultron drones, Omega Red just doesn't cut it when the opponents have so much higher health. You can't really meme the robots with him. So when I pulled Ghost Rider, I finally had that taxi that I needed for Alliance Quest. Now the reason Ghost Rider is so good with suicides is because 1, he's bleed immune, so you're only suffering from poison, and poison is mostly mitigated by willpower, especially if you're running 3 points. But second is when you activate Judgment of Malice with the heavy attack, you get this huge lifesteal passive effect, which every attack is stealing a great chunk of health for a duration of time, and you can really stack this duration of time to be a really long lifesteal passive, allowing you to heal like 40 to 60% of your health if you're really aggressive and you time it right, which is a really good time. So Ghost Rider at number 9 because of his ability to taxi even with suicides. At number 8, I have Ronan. Now, I'm not going to lie, this is a personal pick. He only makes this list because I love the way this guy plays. I cannot wait to have a rank 5 Ronan one day when I can finally do rank ups out of preference and not just out of power picks. But Ronan, I feel like a lot of people play him and they think it's just not enough damage for the amount of effort. Not that this guy is the hardest champion to play, but there is a little bit of effort and thought that goes into it, and not as much damage payoff as I think there should be. But Ronan can shrug both suicides very, very quickly. If the opponent can be stunned and it's not in Alliance War, you can shrug both suicides, losing like 3% if you do it optimally, and even like only 6% if, you know, the AI is being stupidly defensive, etc. And this champion with suicides, he benefits so much, and that damage output feels a lot better. And as a champion who yes, would prefer to run special 2, he can fairly friendly run a special 3 playstyle and mitigate recoil that way. And a big part of running suicides is you want champions that can comfortably special 3 or mitigate recoil in some way, shape, or form. So next up at number 7, I have Aegon. Now, Aegon is down at number 7. I feel like some people will disagree with me here, but I personally think Aegon doesn't need to run suicides to be the absolute powerhouse he is, and that is because there are pros and cons for both sides. Now, Aegon with suicides, he's going to have such a higher damage threshold. The first and second fight's going to be a lot faster, which those are like Aegon's toughest fights, so it's going to feel a lot better when you're getting that free damage. He shrugs the suicides off very quickly, so you're really only losing like 1 to 2 fights worth of suicide damage, and he is a special 3 powerhouse. This insanely long special 3 that just stuns the opponent for up to 7 seconds, and it feels really good, so you don't have to worry about recoil at all. The counter argument for not running suicides with Aegon is that you get to run a special 2 playstyle instead for this huge damage dealing bleed, and it is a ton of damage on the special 2, so I understand why people really like having that value. But also, your first and your second fights will also be a lot longer, so that 60% damage that you're not gaining will translate into a faster ramp-up period, a higher carryover from the earlier fights, so you can, you know, restart that first fight or second fight, until you get like a perfect run, and have a higher overall combo meter going into your next one, which could be potentially really good, especially if you're like still learning Aegon and you want to have a bigger safety net on, say, fights 2 and 3. So, you know, the argument goes both ways, but I definitely think the argument for suicides is much stronger, which is why he makes this list. At number 6, I have Captain Marvel movie. Now, the thing about Captain Marvel movie on this roster is that this is under the assumption that you have Nick Fury, because if you're not running Nick Fury synergy with Captain Marvel movie, you're really not getting the full value out of her. This synergy allows, not this one, Partners in Shield, is the energy charges on Captain Marvel last an additional second. This essentially, when you go binary, allows Captain Marvel to stay in that phase for a very long time, and almost indefinitely, so long as the opponent can be stunned fairly easily. And without this synergy, you just lose those binary ignition charges very, very quickly, and it's hard to maintain a high binary ignition, which doesn't mean the worst. It just means you have to ramp her up every fight instead of like being able to set her up at like a perfect 23 at the end of every fight, so you can just start the fight with a parry and pummel the opponent. But if you're running the Nick Fury synergy, you also get to run the Nick Fury Deadpool X-Force synergy that I mentioned previously with that free heal. And that means when you're using Captain Marvel as like a questing taxi, she just ends every fight with like a special 2 combo. And she gets a free heal every fight. And she goes invulnerable, shrugs both debuffs, even if, you know, Nick Fury is not doing it for you. And as long as she's indestructible, she's not taking recoil damage. There's just so much value out of this champion. And a big part of her is the fact that you want her to be a burst champion who ends the fight while she's binary, and having 60% extra damage is really going to help you end those fights much faster, because she really struggles in longer fights. At number 5, I have Clairvoyant. Now, Clairvoyant, she's not the hardest hitting champion, and running suicides can really help mitigate that feeling. When you're not running suicides, you definitely feel like that lacking damage that all Mystic champions really struggle with, where they all feel like they're almost fighting with rubber swords or foam swords instead of metal ones, but suicides definitely gives a little bit of edge to that blade. But Black Widow Clairvoyant, she has some really compelling reasons beyond just the standard damage benefit, and that is that she starts the fight, every single fight, bleed immune. One quick combo ending with a light attack turns her into a poison immune, so you shrug both debuffs very quickly, barely losing any health. And then finally, her special 2, when you are in Curse of Blood, regenerates health based on the amount of damage dealt. And because of that, having that 60% increased damage and that 30% increased special damage from recoil means that your special 2 is going to heal a lot more health when you're running suicides. So you feel a lot better about those big heals when you're running suicides. Additionally, you just got to be comfortable, recognizing that her suicide or recoil mitigation is not in like mitigating the recoil itself, but just that the fact that she has so much health regeneration on her special 2, if used properly, that as long as you're comfortable staying around 80 to 100% health instead, you don't have to worry too much about recoil. And then finally, at number 4, we have Namor. Now, Namor is an absolute beast of a champion, and his signature ability alone is a solid reason to run suicides, because most times if you're running Namor and you're using him, you want him awakened max sigged, meaning that when you're attacking the opponent, 100% of the damage that he would be taking, including the damage from suicides, is reflected onto the opponent. And if you're running willpower, you're still healing from those suicides. So slow attack combos means that you can heal 1 to 2% health every combo, which really stacks up, especially if you're not blocking or taking block damage, you're only intercepting. And then the second reason for suicides on Namor is his special attacks regenerate 6% of his missing health, which if you're not mitigating that poison debuff off Namor somehow, which really isn't possible unless you're only running half suicides and Nick Fury synergy, this is only 4.2% healing because of the 30% reduced healing from poison, but that still means you're only taking 0.8% damage from recoil, which is a really good amount of recoil mitigation. And the other thing is that Namor really wants to hit super hard with his specials, and this Fury buff is a lot of attack rating, allowing him to get a lot of damage in once you've done a special 3. And yeah, Namor just feels really good with suicides. I think without he still feels good, but you're missing out on some free health and fairly easy recoil mitigation. So next up at number 3, I have Ghost. Now, I love this champion, but the thing about Ghost without suicides is like the fights don't end as quickly. You're not starting with 2 free Fury buffs, but you're still getting that awesome Ghost counterplay of like not ever getting hit and not really having to do a lot of mechanics that most champions would. So yeah, longer fights is probably like the worst drawback here on a champion who's very bursty, but that's not the end of the world. I think that the reason I advocate for suicides with Ghost is the fact that you start with 2 huge Fury buffs when you immediately phase and drop the debuffs into Furies instead, but more importantly is that with Hood synergy, you can fully mitigate recoil damage. You could even run 3 points in recoil and not take any damage from any of the recoil procs, so long as you're doing it properly. And really, once you get that timing down, it's very easy, so long as you're not like tired or like reacting slowly. And it just makes Ghost hit so much harder. But the reason she is down here at number 3 is because there are still better champions who could benefit so much more, and we're going to move on to number 2. Number 2 is Corvus Glaive. Now, I think Corvus Glaive without suicides and Corvus Glaive with suicides are 2 incredibly different champions. Corvus Glaive wants the fights to end after a special 2 rotation. And if you're not ending your fights, before you lose all of your Glaive charges, you're really going to have a bad time getting like no crits, hidden like a twig. But Corvus Glaive, if you can end your fights with, 1 or 2 special 2s, it's a really good time. He hits like a truck at the, high burst power phase. And it's really his first and his second fight that could potentially be the worst for you while you're trying to like ramp him up and trigger those missions and those persistent charges. And if you haven't done those yet, that 60% extra damage is going to make those first fights way better. And it's going to make the later fights when you're hitting for huge special 2s end a lot faster. And personally, I think that Corvus Glaive being this essentially 20 hit clock or closer to like 30 hit clock champion, really want to get the most out of those 30 hits, because after those Glaive charges are gone, you are essentially hitting like a twig. So if you can get the most out of that beginning of the fight, Corvus Glaive really benefits. But also, an important thing is Glaive immunity. While Corvus Glaive has Glaive charges, he doesn't take any damage from bleed debuffs. Cold Snap, Bleed, Shock, or Frostbite, actually. And so that bleed debuff is still active, which means that between poison and bleed and willpower, you're actually healing with 1 point in willpower a very negligible amount, with 3 points in willpower an actually like reasonably noticeable amount. And it's a really good way to recognize that Corvus Glaive isn't suffering from that damage, and because his fights usually end with 1 or 2 special 2s, you're not taking that much recoil damage anyways. So this champion definitely solidifies his place at number 2. For champions, I would turn Suicide Masteries on. And I don't think anyone, even for a second, is surprised to see Omega Red take number 1. Now, the reason Omega Red takes number 1 is because he is poison immune and 90% bleed damage reduction. Now, 1 extra point in Coagulate, and that's 100% damage reduction from bleeds, meaning that you're not taking any damage from your Suicide Masteries. And Omega Red, as long as you're bleeding, he emits his death field, which allows you to go up to 30 death spores on the opponent, and also causes this like passive degeneration when you are near them. So for the first 16 seconds, you get this huge burst window with Omega Red, and if you play it right, you can carry that burst window past when the bleed has already fallen off, and it's a really good amount of damage. And when you don't have that bleed and you're like ramping up to 10 spores and you're just stuck at 10 spores, not able to push past it, it's a huge damage difference. And the amount of time and the duration of time it takes Omega Red to fight is just massively changed between when you're running suicides and when you're not. Not to mention, just that innate 60% increased damage, the amount of healing he gets from like his special 1 and his special 3 can really mitigate any kind of special 2s you throw out there. So this champion has so much sustain, so you don't have to worry too much about the recoil damage you're taking. And overall, Omega Red is the king of Suicide Masteries. If you want to run Omega Red, if this is your favorite champion in the game, turn him on. Give him the respect he deserves. That said, those are the top 10 champions I think I would turn Suicide Masteries on for. I think just like an important factor is that these are not the top 10 champions who benefit from Suicide Masteries, because there are a lot of champions who benefit from them, but there are a lot of champions who benefit from them, but also have many counter arguments for not. These are 10 champions that I feel like benefit way more than they do from not running them. So that said, I hope you guys enjoy, and I will talk to you all later.